For quite some time now, I've been wondering, why doesn't Tesla include a larger battery pack in their rear-wheel drive vehicles? Because a lot of other manufacturers offer it, and that does indeed give you the best electric range. Well, thankfully, we now have it, not only in the Tesla Model 3, but also the larger Tesla Model Y. Concentrating on the latter, prices start from £47,000, at least at the time of filming, and in the UK. And if you want the all-wheel drive model, it will set you back £52,000, and the performance model will cost you £60,000. Just in case you're wondering, when I originally reviewed the Tesla Model Y, when it was a rear-wheel drive vehicle with a smaller battery pack, that could be found for £45,000, the all-wheel drive at £53,000, and the performance model at £60,000. So yes, there are slight little tweaks. Nonetheless, in this review, we're going to see if the new generation model is actually worth its price tag and how it compares to some of its key competitors. So to kick things off, we have to talk about its electric range. And here the manufacturer has not shared its battery capacity, although it's presumed to be sitting at 82 kilowatt hour. Now there is a heat pump that comes included as standard, which is very much appreciated for those colder climate scenarios, as it effectively means that heating the cabin is all that bit more efficient. Now, the WLTP claim sits at roughly 380 miles. However, from my own mixed driving test, I actually netted 315 to 335 miles, which is actually a very impressive figure and a class-leading one at that. As you'll be able to see from the mileage leaderboard, the long-range rear-wheel drive sits at the very top. Now, it's worth considering that, for context, the long-range all-wheel drive Model Y that I previously tested had the 20-inch alloys and therefore netted 260 to 280 miles. Had I had the 19-inch alloys fitted on that press vehicle, I would have expected the figure to be sitting more at the higher end of that range. Nonetheless, what I'm trying to say over here is that the rear-wheel drive model is class-leading and indeed the longest range electric SUV that I've tested to date. And yes, I've tested quite a fair few. Now, when it comes to recouping energy back into the battery pack and being as efficient as possible, there's regenerative braking. Now, if I were to just lift off the accelerator pedal, the vehicle will come to a complete standstill. So therefore, the Model Y, very much like other Tesla vehicles, has got a full one-pedal drive. Now, while that's very much appreciated within those inner city commutes, it is a bit more cumbersome when you're on the motorway because you have to constantly apply pressure on the accelerator pedal, and therefore means that it can be quite tiresome. The reason I highlight this is because on the older generation Teslas, for example the Model 3, or indeed some of its key competitors, you have got the means of adjusting it on the fly via the use of paddle shifters or, for example, via the infotainment system. It's a shame over here that Tesla has taken away that option altogether, so therefore you can't disable it or indeed reduce the regenerative braking effect. Now, of course, aside from recouping energy while on the move, you can also plug it in. And here it's great to see that you've got the Tesla supercharger network. Via the infotainment system, you've also got fantastic route planning, which actually makes it a breeze for those people coming to an EV for the very first time. It's something I've commended Teslas in the past for, and it's just good to see that the Model Y very much follows on with this philosophy. Now, for you to plug it in via, let's say, a V3 supercharger, it can actually attain roughly 250 kilowatts of input, and therefore means it can go from 10 to 80% in around half an hour. Should you find a V2 supercharger, and therefore being capped at 150 kilowatts instead, it will take you roughly 40 minutes to attain the same level of charge. For a 50 kilowatt charger that you'll find more commonly on the motorway, this will take you roughly 1 to 2 hours instead. Now, aside from DC rapid chargers, if you do plug it into a wall box, or more specifically a 3-phase wall box, then you will be able to benefit from the 11 kilowatt onboard charger, and therefore means that you can go from 10 to 100% in roughly 8 to 9 hours. Should you use a regular 7 kilowatt wall box, which will be far more commonly found at home, then this time will go up to roughly 11 hours. As for a 3-pin input, it will take you over 40 hours. Now, despite it actually being quite a modern vehicle, it's a shame that there is no vehicle-to-load charging. In other words, the ability to discharge the battery pack to another electric vehicle or, of course, a household appliance. A feature that I've seen included in a lot of its modern rivals, and it would have been great if Tesla actually included it within the Model Y. So past efficiency, what about when it comes to performance? Well, here you have got a motor that's planted on the rear axle, and that drives the rear wheels only. Now, the manufacturer has not shared any sort of performance data, but it does feel like it's got quite a bit of power. Speaking of which, I actually had it tested using RaceLogic's Performance Box Touch and had it tested from 0 to 20 miles an hour in 1.83 seconds, 0 to 30 miles an hour in 2.82 seconds, 0 to 60 miles an hour in 5.89 seconds, and just for reference, the all-wheel drive model clocked in at 4.68 seconds, and in 50 to 70 miles an hour in 2.45 seconds. I also recorded a peak acceleration of 0.5 Gs. Now, despite the vehicle operating on a rear-wheel drive configuration only, I had no issues with the level of confidence when I was trekking around winding country routes. Indeed, it had good level of traction and it felt pretty planted. Furthermore, it didn't suffer from too much body roll either, which incited a little bit of extra driver's feel. Although it's worth mentioning over here that the overall driver's input can't quite compete with some of the alternatives out there on the market, namely from the likes of BMW and Jaguar. Now, speaking of which over here, it is actually quite a shame that the suspension system has not actually been tuned for the softer drives. And here it just feels a little bit stiffer in comparison to what you might expect for a family-sized SUV. Don't get me wrong, it's not too bad in the grand scheme of things, but it does feel a little bit stiff when you're going over potholes, anomalies, or indeed speed bumps, and therefore is a worthwhile consideration if you're comparing and contrasting it with some of its key competitors. Now, another thing to consider is the overall cabin noise, where unfortunately the Model Y is let down in this department, especially if you compare it to some of its key competitors, for example from the likes of BMW, Genesis or Jaguar, or even its smaller sibling, the Model 3. Indeed, the Model Y does suffer from sort of low-end resonance and indeed a little bit of rattle when you're traversing on uneven terrain and on the motorway. It's not exactly a deal breaker, but just something I thought I should highlight in this review. Equally, if you're comparing and contrasting with some of its rivals, there is no head-up display or an instrument cluster. And instead, if you want to check your traversing speed or the safety systems that are in operation, you have to glance towards the center of the dashboard, which in my opinion is a little bit of a safety concern because you're taking your eyes further away from the road. Nonetheless, this is very much the same case that could be said about the vast majority of other Teslas out there, but again, something I thought I should highlight when you're comparing and contrasting it with some of its rivals. Apart from that as well, it is nice to see that you have got traditional stalks behind the steering wheel. I highlight this point because for those people who have come across the modern generation Teslas, for example the Model 3, they completely do away with the traditional stalks. And as a result means that you have to press a button on the steering wheel, which is not that intuitive when you're going around a roundabout, and swipe up or down to initiate a gear on the screen. This means that the Model Y just feels a bit more intuitive for those people who are coming across a Tesla for the very first time and won't take certain people by surprise. Now, aside from the physical buttons and scroll wheels that are found on the steering wheel, there are no buttons that are found within the cabin. And indeed here, the climate controls are done directly via the infotainment system. Thankfully, the 15-inch landscape display is super responsive and vivid, and it provides you plenty of customization and even arcaded entertainment apps, all of which are very much appreciated and put certain infotainment systems to shame. However, it is worth mentioning that Android Auto and Apple CarPlay are not supported, and therefore means that you cannot use some of your favorite apps or route planning systems, or indeed have some of your points of interest. Instead, you're going to have to reconfigure this via the Tesla system. Something that might not be exactly a deal breaker for certain individuals, but I do think the inclusion of Android Auto and Apple CarPlay would have been nice to see, especially in a Tesla. Now, what I really do love, however, is the Tesla app, because not only does it provide you controls from afar, for example, allowing you to precondition the cabin or indeed initiate Sentry mode, which gives you a degree of security to see your vehicle no matter where it is, but also to have it as a wireless key, therefore meaning that you can just go in and out of the vehicle just with your phone rather than having to use any sort of key fob or indeed a key card, which is what is used by Tesla vehicles. Now, what's more is I absolutely love the 14-speaker audio system that is comprised within the Tesla Model Y. Now, within the UK and Europe, you have got a 14-speaker system that comes fitted as standard. And this audio system was previously reviewed by myself on the channel. And in case you're wondering about how it does across the sound frequency range, make sure you check out my detailed audio review that can be found up on your pop-up banner or by following the links down in the description below. Well, however, what I will say is that in certain markets, including in the USA, the rear-wheel drive model, which is on review, only has a 7-speaker configuration instead. Unfortunately, I've got no means of actually testing this, so I can't exactly comment about it, but it's a shame over here that Tesla has downgraded the audio system in the rear-wheel drive vehicle in certain markets. Thankfully, that is not the case, at least at the time of filming and in the UK and across Europe. Now, another area where the Model Y shines is when it comes to the overall storage. Now, first off, within the cabin, you have got the glove box. Then towards the front of the center console, you've got two wireless charging bays where they've also been lined in fabric material, which prevents your phone from sliding around. Further down, you've got a small little retractable area where you'll also find a non-slip area and also two USB Type-C ports, which can be used for charging. Further down, you've got two cup holders, and then you've also got a nice large area within the center armrest. Here you'll also find a 12-volt socket. As for the door bins, the front two are large enough to accommodate a 500ml bottle alongside some small to medium-sized valuables, while at the rear it's unsurprisingly a little bit more limited. It's nice to see that all the door bins have been lined in fabric, which is the same that could be said about the vast majority of its competitors. It's also good to see that you have got a pull-down armrest compartment with two cup holders and two USB Type-C ports, which are found towards the rear portion of the center console. Now, where it really excels is when it comes to the overall boot capacity, because here you've got 854 litres to play around with, or a whopping 2,158 litres when you drop down the seats. Indeed, it's actually class leading in this department and even competes with those very larger sized SUVs. Furthermore, it's actually very practical. You have got a hatchback design with an electric tailgate that comes fitted as standard, 40-20-40 rear split folding seats, which are also electronically released from the boot, which is all that bit more practical. You've also got a flat floor, an absolutely humongous underfloor compartment, which can be used for taking your charging cables or even your weekly shops. And you've even got a 117 litre front capacity. That's a compartment that's found underneath the front bonnet, and that makes it all that bit more practical. Although it's worth mentioning over here that the front can only be electronically released but then manually closed, while the rear is fully electronically operated. So what about when it comes to seating comfort? Well, the front two seats themselves have been propped higher. However, given the fact that you've got full electronic controls, it's a non-issue, so therefore you'll find the right sort of driving position. It's also nice to see that both front seats are heated and also very soft and accommodating. Also, it is worth mentioning over here that the steering wheel is heated as standard. Now, as for the second row, it is actually exceptional. Not only the fact that all the seats, and yes, including the rear middle seat, is heated, but also the fact that the headroom and legroom are absolutely phenomenal. As someone who's just under 6 foot, I had no problems whatsoever, and I actually could fully stretch out my legs. This is because the manufacturer has optimized the under portion of the front seats and even the center console area, and therefore means that no matter where you're sat, you'll be actually left pretty comfortable. Furthermore, given it's an electric vehicle, it's no surprise to see that you have got a completely flat footwell design, although the same couldn't be said about some of its rivals, and even the fact that you have got a panoramic roof which comes fitted as standard, you have still got fantastic headroom. Now, it's worth mentioning over here that if you do want an additional sunshade, you'll have to purchase this as an additional extra. Now, comparing this to the modern generation Model 3, it is worth mentioning that the Model Y still does not have a rear display. It really doesn't bother me in the slightest, but just something I thought I should highlight, especially given the fact that it's not included in a lot of rival alternatives. Now, elsewhere, for you to use the vehicle, there is a pressure sensor that's found within the driver's seat. It's actually quite intuitive if you're a single occupant jumping in and out of the vehicle. It's worth mentioning, however, that if you were to jump out of the vehicle and there's someone still sat inside, the vehicle will power down, and therefore they'll have to reach towards the infotainment system in order to reinitiate it. For example, the climate controls or the entertainment apps. Elsewhere, when it comes to exiting the vehicle, there is a simple electronic release, which makes it very intuitive. Now, of course, in an emergency situation, there is a manual release as well. However, getting into the vehicle can take a little bit of getting used to, due to how the doors are designed. And given that you haven't got any sort of light, it means that when you're approaching the vehicle at a very dark scenario, it can be a little bit hard to find the actual door handles. Nonetheless, once you get your head around it, it should become second nature. This actually brings me onto its exterior design, and I'll be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below. It's worth mentioning over here it hasn't been updated from the previous generation model. At the front it looks pretty sleek, with the headlights actually feeding pretty well with the bonnet and also the wheel arches. As for the side profile, it's got a nice sort of silhouette, although it's worth mentioning over here that the wheel arches are not fully body coloured. However, the small little plastic insert does not protrude too much and has actually got a really small profile, so I've got no real complaints. As for the alloys, you've got 19-inch that come fitted as standard, and these would be actually recommended over the 20-inch alloys, which are an optional £2,100 because they give you better range. Now, as for the rear, it has got a really nice look to it because you've got an integrated spoiler and the taillights bring everything into a nice uniform look. Now, as for your colors options, you have got white that comes fitted as standard. However, black and blue will cost you an additional £1,300, while a red and silver finish will cost you a whopping £2,600. So moving swiftly on, we get onto safety, and here it was tested in 2022 by Euro NCAP and awarded a full 5 out of 5 stars, scoring a whopping 98% in adult occupancy, 87% in child occupancy, and a ridiculous 98% in its safety assist scores. Indeed, it's among one of the safest vehicles out there on the planet. Now, in terms of the driver assistance systems, you have got lane departure warning, emergency lane departure avoidance, automatic blind spot monitoring with a camera system which is integrated directly via the infotainment system, which I do think is an absolute game changer when it comes to checking your blind spot. You've then got forward collision warning, automatic emergency brake, speed assist, driver drowsy warning, and traffic aware cruise control with stop and go technology, which actually works a treat. Combining this with the likes of auto steer, it means that when you're driving on the motorway, it does actually take away a lot of the stress. Now, you can actually go a step further from this by adding enhanced autopilot for an additional £3,400. In my opinion, it's not really worth it because at the time of filming, it only adds automatic lane change assist and also takes exits on motorways. That is, of course, when you are using the autopilot feature. Then you've also got the full self-driving pack, which will set you back a whopping £6,800. This has definitely got its pros and cons and brings the likes of traffic light and stop sign control. At the time of filming, again, I do think it's somewhat preliminary, at least in the UK and Europe, and therefore it's not really worth the overall package. But of course, if you want to be at the forefront of autonomous driving technology, then you might want to consider some of these options. Now, to round off, I would like to talk about parking and visibility. And concentrating on the latter, at the front you've got a really nice wide windscreen. However, it's worth mentioning that the A-pillar is actually pretty chunky and therefore means that you kind of have to peer around them when you're going around corners, for example, let's say a roundabout. As for the side, it's actually really easy to check for your blind spot. However, at the rear, it's actually quite limited, even if you were to drop down the rear middle headrest. Thankfully, however, you have got high-resolution cameras that come fitted as standard, and therefore it gives you that extra peace of mind when it comes to reversing in a tight parking space. Now, on that note over here, you have got Tesla Vision, which effectively uses the camera-based system to give you an awareness of your surroundings. It's a shame, however, that Tesla has gotten rid of the ultrasonic sensors, because I do think that Tesla Vision does have a little bit of issues when it comes to vegetation. It seems to pick them up as a solid object, where in reality they're not. And ultrasonic sensors seem to do a little bit of a better job in this department. I would have wished that Tesla had incorporated Tesla Vision alongside ultrasonic sensors in order to give you the best sort of visibility and understanding of your surroundings. So with all that in mind, it brings us on to our verdict of the long-range rear-wheel drive Tesla Model Y. And truth be told, it's an absolutely fantastic electric SUV. It kind of builds upon the previous generation model, but indeed gives you much better electric range, class leading to say the least. Not only that, you've got plenty use of technology within the cabin, a good amount of driver assistance systems, class leading rear occupancy space and also boot capacity. You've also got that front space as well, which is somewhat of a rarity even in modern electric vehicles. The driving comfort isn't exactly the best, and nor the driving dynamics, but it should certainly suffice for the vast majority of consumers. And also its asking price is actually also pretty competitive, especially if you compare and contrast it with what else you can find out there on the market. As a result of all of this, it's very easy to recommend this vehicle, and as such it gets our Best Buy award. Now, I'd be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below, and if you would pick it over some rival alternatives. Now, of course, if you have enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Chris from TotallyEV, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.